Thank you for the introduction. So I wanted to start with two disclaimers that are generally, if you don't like what I'm saying, don't blame it on anybody that I'm associated with. It's my words and opinions. And if I do talk about any entity or topic, I'm not necessarily endorsing or condemning it, just bringing it up for discussion. So, first quotation I wanted to present to you was this one from JAMA in 1912, which was part of JAMA will do a JAMA 100 years ago feature every now and again. And this one says, unfortunately, advances in scientific medicine are frequently heralded as being of much more value and importance than they can possibly prove to be. I think the previous two presentations did a pretty good job explaining why that might be, but I also wanted to highlight again that this isn't a new problem, which on the one hand is kind of depressing that we've been trying for so long as a scientific community to correct some of these things, but it also means that we need to kind of look at the long game as well, and I think some of David's closing comments spoke to that really well in terms of we need to look at things a little bit more than just in these singular snapshots, but to look over time. So I'm going to limit most of my comments to kind of just in the publishing project range, and in particular thinking from the initiation of a project through to the end of publication and a little bit beyond. So thinking a lot more about study execution and reporting. And some of the existing common checks and balances that have even been brought up are review panels for funding. When you go to start a study, what science are you bringing forward? What is the quality of it? And then when you're developing the project, there's some comment already about study registration, as well as review boards, like institutional review boards, things like that. And then during the project execution, the review boards may still take a look at it. Writing is kind of a void. I think David's comment spoke well to that at the university level at least, there's not necessarily widespread support for the writing up of the project. And then during publication, there's peer review, which isn't always occurring either. So this is kind of some of the existing common checks and balances, but there's been a number of proposed or recent improvements to some of these checks and balances to hopefully improve study design, study execution, and study reporting. And that includes building on the study registration, as well as registering other studies, so whether it be systematic reviews and meta-analyses or observational studies, and improving clinical trial registries. And also there have been some attempts to peer review methods before a project is even executed. During writing, there have been some improvements as well and some proposed checks and balances, including the guidelines and checklists that were mentioned, as well as an idea of a portable peer review. And I'll talk about some of these here in a little bit. During publication, there have been a number of attempts to improve the peer review process as well, including some of these two-phase peer reviews that I'll discuss a little bit more, data sharing that'll be discussed more later, and post-publication peer review as well. So right now you publish a paper, and sometimes you might get maybe a commentary in a journal that nobody will read except for people that are really into the topic, or you get people complaining on websites, but trying to pull this information after a study is completed to keep the dialogue going. And then there are also some reproducibility initiatives that I'll discuss. So clinical trial registries were described a little bit already, but to give a little bit of a background, in 1997, the FDA Modernization Act required trial registrations for investigational new drug applications. And in 2000, the NIH released clinicaltrials.gov, so these could actually be registered somewhere that was accessible. And then the ICMJE started requiring trial registration in 2005 to publish any of the clinical trials. In 2006, the World Health Organization established trial registration policy, and they also launched an international clinical trial registry platform. And importantly, in 2007, the FDAA Amendments Act actually required more trials to be registered, so expanding the scope, giving more information that needed to be reported, but also giving it teeth. Whether those teeth have been used is a whole other issue, but there can be fines up to $10,000 a day for not reporting the results of a clinical trial. And then in 2013, the European Clinical Trials Database expands. So when I say recent in the title of this talk, considering that at least 100 or the reference to the comment 500 years ago about some of these things, your definition of recent may be different than mine, but some of these things certainly are very important today. Now, whether these mandatory reporting guidelines are actually being enforced is another question altogether. So this paper looked at the number of trials that were subject to mandatory reporting, which had reported results at I believe they gave them a year to report those results. And what we see is that at the bottom, I don't know if I got a pointer.
It's the center button, the button in the vertical button in the center.
There we go. So yeah, there were 22% of all of the studies that actually had complied with the mandatory reporting guidelines. So that's unfortunately low. It was also interesting, though, that the industry funded studies actually at a higher percentage. And the reasons behind that are completely speculative, but it does indicate that we need collectively to do a better job reporting clinical trials and registering them, as well as reporting the results. In addition, there's been some initiatives to register other types of studies. So there is the Prospero Systematic Review Registry, which was launched in 2011. This is coordinated through the University of York Center for Reviews and Dissemination. And as of January 16th, there were almost 2,700 systematic reviews registered. It's also important to note that the National Institute of Health Research requires that all of the NIHR-funded systematic reviews to be registered. So there's impetus from a government entity as well to use this registry. And I said supported, but endorsed may be a more appropriate term. It's endorsed by the Equator Network, which was nicely described previously. So the idea of a systematic review registry is even if you're doing a systematic review and meta-analysis of randomized controlled trials, that process is actually an observational process. So you are just observing the studies that have been done. And so much like other observational studies, it can quickly get to the point where you start doing some subgroup analyses and find some interesting things, and by the end, it might not be the primary reason that systematic review is being conducted. Also, it helps reduce the amount of redundancy if you can go in before conducting a systematic review and see, oh, somebody's already reported that they're doing one. And I've certainly come across that, and from people that do systematic reviews, that's been a very useful thing to decrease waste. But it's not necessarily universally supported by the scientific community. In this piece in particular, titled Meta-Analysis Protocol Registration, but who will guard the guardians, or who will police the police, hearkening back to the Roman times. The opinion piece concluded with, "We fear that these bureaucratic impositions are creeping up on us whether we like it or not, and frankly, we like it not." So it's not necessarily widely accepted by everybody. The reasons why it could be important aren't necessarily universally accepted. In addition, like I mentioned previously, there are some issues in terms of just because you register a study doesn't mean that it's actually going to be followed through, and I think that was highlighted well in the previous talk, or I suppose some of Denny's comments. And so this is one in particular that was of recent importance to me, studying obesity. And the registration indicated that the primary outcomes would be all-cause mortality and or cardiovascular events, fatal and non-fatal. So put two pretty broad categories to get together there for the primary outcome. And then the analysis of subgroups or subsets, exploration of subgroups will be based on meta-regression models and or relevant clinical rationale. So basically the registration says, we'll look at kind of what we want to look at. And that this isn't, unique to this one. It's difficult sometimes to say what will be the final analysis plan. And in fact, when you look at the paper that came out, it was the results were demonstrated that a subgroup analysis showed a modest significant association between this metabolic healthy phenotype, a metabolically healthy obesity phenotype, and increased mortality and or cardiovascular events. But the conclusions were there is no healthy pattern of increased weight based on one of the subgroup analyses. So there is, the previous comment I brought up of who's going to, guard the guardians. In this case, they might have actually been correct in terms of just because it's registered doesn't mean it's being used to confirm the quality of the final reported study. And I also mentioned observational study registration, and the rationale is similar to that of the randomized clinical trial registration, and that's respect for human participants, evidence-based medicine. If we're going to be doing a study and we're going to make evidence-based medicine, we need to bring in all the evidence we have. Mitigation of publication bias, which was discussed earlier. Clear documentation of pre-specified study design, which I think the last example highlighted that pretty well. Identification of gaps in research, avoidance of duplication, and also public record. And I think that goes back to the taxpayer comments that were made previously. If we're doing these things, particularly with taxpayer dollars, we have a responsibility to report those. And in a opinion piece titled Registration of Observational Studies, Is It Time? A group from the clinicaltrials.gov group noted that existing registries do accommodate observational studies. And I want to say at that time it was about 17% of studies in clinicaltrials.gov were observational studies. So it's feasible, and a lot of the rationale is the same as registering clinical trials. The American Journal of Clinical Nutrition requires registration of clinical trials and observational studies. The British Medical Journal stated that they now publish a large amount of observational research, and they actively support the registration of observational studies. And the Lancet also says that they believe that when feasible, investigators should register observational studies on a World Health Organization compliant registry before they begin. However, this sentiment is not universally accepted, much like the systematic review registries. And in this piece, titled Registration of Observational Studies Does Not Enhance Validity, argues that the hypothesis that is generated, it doesn't matter if it's generated a priori or post hoc in terms of whether or not it's valid. And the Journal of Epidemiology itself, after there was a group conference discussing whether observational studies should be registered, titled a editorial, The Registration of Observational Studies When Metaphors Go Bad, and that's saying that long cohort studies should not be made as to be similar to randomized controlled trials in terms of scope. And they state, at its best, epidemiology is a process of synthesizing evidence within data sets and across populations with due respect for biologic plausibility and a skeptic's eye for alternative explanations. On such matters, registration has no bearing. So the Journal of Epidemiology itself, through the editors, has taken a pretty strong stance against observational study registration. So moving on to peer review. I believe most of you are fairly familiar with the standard peer review and maybe some of the new protocols that people are trying to put in place, but I just wanted to make sure that we're all speaking the same language here. And so there's the idea of the single blinded peer review, and that's typically the traditional peer review. And that's where the authors don't know who reviews the paper, but the reviewers know who the authors are. And then there's some that have proposed and implemented a double-blind peer review where neither group knows each other. But there's also an open names peer review, which is similar to traditional, but both groups either know during the review who is who, or after the review will know both the authors and the reviewers. There's an open process peer review, which is where you, for instance, can put up the article online into an open portal to be reviewed by the community, and that's why it might also be called community peer review. Then there's published peer review, which is after the peer review. All the peer review comments end up going with the paper, so you can see the improvement process. And then there's the idea of post-publication peer review, which is formal or informal peer review after the publication. So comments of the quality or validity of the study from a larger group end up going with the paper. And there's also, I mentioned, the two-stage or the two-phase peer review, and there have been a number of different proposals for this. And so one such example is the methods would be reviewed prior to completing the study. And that way you're evaluating the quality of the science before it's even conducted. And then given that the protocol is followed, then the paper would be published, given faithful completion of it. There's another version, which is you just submit the methods to a journal, and then they evaluate the science apart from the results. Another example would be submitting a paper to the open process peer review, followed by a typical peer review. So the classic peer review that people are used to and think of is starting to shift into a number of these different things to try to improve some of this peer review. There is, of course, the problem, and I probably should have stated this on the first timeline, that every single step we add in here also brings with it the risk of diffusion of responsibility. So if there's an institutional review board, and there's a funding agency, and there's a university publishing officer, people tend to go, well, somebody else will catch it if I miss it. So I think that's where some of the former comments about needing to have the training as well would be important. But why would we want to focus on peer review? So peer review, as was stated, is kind of considered the hallmark of scientifically valid results. If you bring up a well-written, well-analyzed piece in the New York Times that goes against somebody's point of view, they'll likely go, oh, well, that's not a peer-reviewed article. Show me a peer-reviewed article. And that seems to carry the most weight. And it's also the idea that a few scientists are deciding the fate of a paper indefinitely. With the exception of fraud or misconduct, once that study is published through peer review, it's part of the scientific record forever. The value of a peer review has been estimated at $400, and I forgot to put the citation for that there. But the amount of time it takes an individual to complete a peer review, and on top of that, the people that are peer reviewing are often not paid. And it's also the peer review process is considered combative instead of constructive a lot of times. So you go in reviewing a paper, figuring out what's wrong with it, and deciding, which level of reject should it get? Reject and resubmit, or just outright reject. Very few papers are done so well that they're accepted right away. And so the idea is that we might be able to come up with a more, constructive peer review. And I like to think of it also in terms of a peer review burden per publishing scientist. So if we think about how many manuscripts an author publishes, or manuscripts an author submits, divided by the number of authors is the proportion, essentially, of each paper that an author is responsible for, times the number of times that paper is submitted. So if it starts at a high-tier journal and plunks its way down, then each one of those is accumulating more peer reviews that generally aren't passed on, and then however many reviews there are per submission. So if we use an example of an author that submits 10 manuscripts or creates 10 manuscripts a year with 4 authors per manuscript on average, an average of 3 submissions, we'll say, with 3 reviewers per submission, that author, to match the number of peer reviews they're creating, would have to do 22 and a half to kind of have an equilibrium. That's a lot of peer reviews, and it's also worth almost $10,000 of time that's not necessarily being covered. So what are some ways that we can improve these? Well, Nature did try to actually do this in 2006 to actually, not really experimentally, but to test one of these open peer reviews. And so they invited authors to allow their paper to be hosted on a public site for comment prior to publication. And of the 1,369 papers that survived the editorial review, only 71 chose to participate. So there might not, at this time, there wasn't necessarily as much enthusiasm for it in terms of actually putting your paper out there, and whether this is the result of peer review being considered combative or being afraid of being scooped, things like that is unclear. But 33 of those didn't even receive any comments. 38 papers received comments, but only a total of 92 were received. And then the editors went through and actually rated the value of the comments themselves on a scale of 1 to 5, with 1 is actively unhelpful, and 5 is that it directly influenced their decision. No comments that were received in this open platform were rated 5, so none of them influenced their actual decision on the publication. Only 4 of those 90-some comments were rated at 4, with major points in line with reviewers' comments. And so the average scores for editorial type comments was 2.6 and technical was 1.8. So they concluded that despite enthusiasm for the concept, open peer review was not widely popular, either among authors or by scientists invited to comment. Now this was in 2006. Things have changed a lot. Was the iPhone even around then? You know, now if people could, on their way make a comment on their, smartphones or things have changed dramatically since then. And they didn't go on to conclude that this was a bad system. But I wanted to highlight that this journal at least took the opportunity to try to do more of an experimental design to test some of these things, to get the data, to see if these things actually improve research reporting quality. But interestingly, there have been a couple journals that have picked up this model. And so the F1000 Research, for instance, the article is submitted, it goes through a basic in-house pre-publication check for plagiarism, for overall quality, for ethics concerns, and then it's published right away on the site with a data repository. So just on the F1000 Research, and then it is subject to this open peer review, where people can come in, tear it apart, make comments, say what's good, what's bad, what changes should be made, and then the article can be revised, and the process is iterative, and then once it is to a point that people think that it's a good quality paper that should be put into the scientific record, then it's actually indexed in PubMed and other databases. Again, that's why I put the disclaimer at the beginning. I don't know how well this works. I don't know in terms of the quality. I'm sure there have been some data collected, but just wanted to show that this has been actually implemented. It was also implemented something similar by atmospheric chemistry and physics, though I would like to point out that in that Nature study that I discussed, it was more the atmospheric chemistry and physics and climate scientists that actually were more likely to have their papers to be openly reviewed. So it could also be discipline specific. And their indication of how this has been good for the quality is that 3 years after launch, it ranked 12 out of 169 journals in meteorology and atmospheric sciences and environmental sciences by impact factor. So whatever your thoughts are about impact factor, that's the quality metric they're using here. So I also mentioned that when a paper is submitted for peer review, it ends up that peer review a lot of times will just fizzle and die and not go along with the paper. So hopefully the authors will take that peer review and constructively add it to their paper. But there have been some efforts to increase the portability of peer review. So if somebody in the audience is doing a peer review, it doesn't just die when they have to submit it to another publication. So BMC's Genome Biology, they indicated they accept around 10% of submitted papers, but they pass 40% of the rejected ones on to others within the BMC journal group. And so this is one way within a publishing group that they're able to attach that peer review and send it on. So it doesn't just fizzle out and die, and that time and value is wasted. INBO Press, which is a biology group, they are also encouraged to transfer referee reports within the journal system. And there's other publishing groups that do this type of thing as well. But there's also I don't want to say growing because there's only 2 that I'm aware of, but from 0 to 2 is, I suppose, a growth. The idea of a portable peer review service. And so one such service is called the Peerage of Science, and that's where the paper is submitted, and they suggest the author gets to set their time frame that they're interested in having met. And so at stage 1, they submit for reviews, and then they do a peer review of the peer review. So to make sure that the peer reviews are actually quality, you get another tier of looking at the comments to make sure they're coherent, to make sure they're useful. Then the manuscript's revised and uploaded or withdrawn for resubmission, and then the final evaluation of the revised manuscript, and they put publishing at the end because that's the hope. And at any point along this process, the peer reviews are available to any subscribing journal. The authors may accept a publishing offer or export the peer reviews at any time. And for authors and reviewers, the process is free. So this has been something relatively new, with the idea that the peer review can be kind of decentralized, or I suppose it would be more centralized, but decoupled from the journal. And at any point when they're doing the peer review, a journal that might be interested can come and put in an offer for publication. Another system that's kind of like this is Rubric. They're on phase 2 of their development right now. And the idea is that the author submits a paper and they go through that same plagiarism and ethics check, and then the paper is matched to 3 reviewers. The difference in this system is that the peer reviewers are actually paid. So I believe it's $100 for doing a peer review for Rubric. And the idea is that they think you can get a faster peer review that way, and they hope a better peer review that way. And then the reviewers complete their scorecard, so it's a standardized peer review that they're hoping will be able to be used across journals. And then journal recommendations, so they recommend what journal it might be good for, and then the author receives reports and hopefully is able to submit the paper. The important thing to consider here is that it costs the author either $500, $600, or $700, depending on what tier they want to enter it into. So that's an important consideration here, whereas the other one is free. And then I wanted to talk a little bit about post-publication peer review. And so there's 2 that I'm aware of that are kind of larger. And the first one is PubMed Commons, which has just recently been released. And the idea is that you're able to, after reading a paper, go onto PubMed Commons, and it's like the comments section on any newspaper article. And so anybody can go in and make a comment. And so right here, there's a comment from me from a paper that I came across where the paper had been corrected, but it wasn't linked in PubMed. So I had seen people citing this paper, but I don't think most of the people citing it even knew there was a correction. So I was able to add that information. There's also people that will do critiques, or in this case, added a little information. They say, "Thank you for an excellent article. The fistula between the right ventricle and right coronary artery is probably consistent with the vessel of Werner." I don't know if I pronounced that right, but so it's actually scientific conversation on the articles as well that tracks with the paper over time. So these comments aren't lost, or they're not just put on something like news journal's website. And anybody in the room right now that's published a paper can make a comment on PubMed Commons, and they're hoping to expand it from there. Another system is PubPeer, and this came out before PubMed Commons. This is one where it does link to any article that they're able to find on there, and they have conversations. And this one in particular, this comment was saying, this is such a great paper, I wish it had been published in a higher tier journal, and this thing is amazing. And so you can have all these comments, and they're also trying to integrate it with PubMed. Right now it's through a browser-based plugin. But what's important about this is that hopefully we'll be getting some more constructive feedback on articles over time, instead of the 2 comments that come to mind or this paper is a piece of rubbish and no one should bother reading it. That's not really good quality post-publication feedback for a paper. And then there's also kind of alternative publishing paradigms. So the Frontiers journals, this is an independent peer review process where the reviewers go through, and it's also an open, interactive peer review process where there's actually an active dialogue trying to figure out how to improve different steps, ask for clarification, and then for some of the post-publication peer review in this group, the tiers concept is that if it's a paper the community thinks is particularly good, it'll be raised to another tier and get more information. So it first goes to a specific journal and then goes up to kind of a more community journal as opposed to the typical top-down approach of Nature and Science and then the sub-papers. So it's just another way to, I guess, look at publishing in that regard. Then I wanted to finish up with some comments about reproducibility initiatives. So Psychological Sciences has had in the past decade or so some pretty big scandals, and rather than trying to just push it off and say, no, it's just a subset, the psychology field seems to be actively trying to improve ways of showing the validity of their science. And one particular example is the Association for Psychological Science has registered replication reports. And this idea is that the psychological science should emphasize robust, replicable, and generalizable results. And so they need to be able to directly replicate some of the psychological findings. And so they believe in publishing these replications. And the general flow is that the protocol for a proposed replication is submitted to the original authors. So the idea is that the original authors will review it, and then more details about the method and the situation come out in this process, rather than right now you might bury it in a supplement or not even publish some of the methods. This way, iteratively figure out what needs to be done to reproduce this phenomenon. And then they post the protocol online, and then any group can come along and follow this protocol to try to reproduce the results. And then the results are published with the paper as a reproducibility or a replication report. Another example is the Reproducibility Initiative, and they say rewarding reproducible research. The idea here is kind of similar. You can submit any paper to ask it to be reproduced. My one probably big beef with this is that they say if your study is chosen, the results of the validation studies will be provided to you in confidence, and you will have the option to publish the replicated results. So here, it's they say they will publish general overall metrics of how many studies were attempted and how many were validated, but they won't actually make it so the attempt at replicating any particular study is published with it. And that I kind of disagree with in terms of if the resources are going to be spent to replicate a study, the results I do believe should be published. And like many of the registration initiatives, this isn't necessarily, I suppose, universally supported either. And there was this nice piece called the Risks of the Replication Drive with the tag of the push to replicate findings could shelve promising research and unfairly damage the reputations of careful, meticulous scientists. And Andrew Gilman had a nice retort to this, and he actually saw this as he found the silver lining in terms of if there's people pushing back, that means it's a strong enough force that people that aren't happy with it are actually paying attention to it. So I like that optimism. There's enough force that somebody's going to argue with you. That means that they actually are afraid that it'll happen. So just a short moving forward slide. I think David did a good job mentioning some of these in terms of collecting data, showing what's working, experiment, evaluate. If we want to see things get better, I think we need to treat publishing also as a science. In terms of if we're going to say these peer review initiatives are going to be beneficial, I think we should try to demonstrate that they'll be beneficial, or any good scientist will probably come along and just say, well, that makes a lot of sense, but where are the data? One response in the Journal of Epidemiology to that observational study registration conference I mentioned earlier was called To Register or Not to Register, and he says, arguably, this should have been the leading recommendation, the gathering and analysis of evidence to establish the dimensions and characteristics of the problem to be addressed through registration. And I would just generalize that to any of the other solutions that we're proposing. So thank you very much.